Hello and welcome to The Language of Power, a podcast brought to you by the European Policy Centre's Europe in the World programme. Every 2 weeks we bring you insight on the latest geopolitical developments, how they affect Europe, and how Europe can affect them. I'm Paul Taylor, Senior Visiting Fellow at the EPC, and I'll be your host on these deep dives into global and European politics and security. Today we're going to talk about economic security, which is highly political too, ahead of the EPC's second Brussels Economic Security Forum, which convenes next week on June the 4th and 5th. One of the central questions they will be discussing will be how to prevent an economic China shock 2.0 from destroying swathes of European manufacturing industry. The numbers are implacable. China had a trade surplus of 360 billion euros with the EU in 2025. That's $1 billion a day, and exports soared by a further 21% in the first quarter of this year. Partly, this is due to superior Chinese technology in areas such as electric vehicles and batteries and solar panels, as well as to far cheaper prices. But it's clear that Beijing is also weaponizing its state-driven industrial power with massive subsidies for key sectors and a deliberately undervalued currency to turbocharge exports. The question is, what can and should Europe do to stem the wave and shield industries such as steel, automotive, chemicals and machinery? In the words of EU Trade Commissioner Maroš Šefčovič, we simply can't just look on while these industries are lost. From an economic security point of view, for job security, it really counts if you have production in your country, he told the Financial Times. Well, pressure is mounting within the European Union for tougher measures to confront the threat and force China to accept a voluntary rebalancing of trade by reining in exports, reducing subsidies, and opening its market wider to European goods and investment. The alternative, for which France, as usual, is leading the charge, is to take new powers to hit back with tariffs. Last week, President Emmanuel Macron called for the EU to adopt trade powers equivalent to Section 301 of the US Trade Act of 1974, which allows the administration to investigate unfair or discriminatory trade practices and rapidly impose tariffs in response. Germany, the EU's own export champion, has so far been reluctant because of the likelihood that such action, or even the threat of it, would trigger Chinese retaliation against vital German exports of cars, chemicals and machines. But Berlin, too, increasingly recognizes that something must be done to stop the Chinese wave from sweeping away whole sectors of Germany's own industry and jobs. Well, joining me to discuss these issues is Georg Riekeles, Associate Director here at the EPC, Head of the Europe's Political Economy Programme and co-organiser of that Brussels Economic Security Forum, and Yanmei Xie, a Senior Associate Fellow at the Mercator Institute for Chinese Studies, better known to its friends as MERICS, and the Asia Society Switzerland, and a specialist on China's political economy and industrial policy. Welcome to both of you. Georg, let me start with you. In the Brussels Economic Security Review, which is being published at next week's forum, you and Varg Volkmann write that Europe, quotes, is entering a China shock of historic proportions. China's no longer simply the world's factory, you argue. It's becoming, quotes, the world's systemic industrial surplus power. Tell us how things reached this point. Did China make the right policy choices and Europe the wrong ones, or is there something more sinister at work?
Thank you, Paul. It's a pleasure to be on your podcast. And I think you're framing these questions in the right terms. But maybe it's not only about good choices versus bad choices. I think what we need to focus on is that China has made a lot of strategic choices and Europe has maybe been lacking the right strategy to face this new world we're in. And I think rather than looking at the past, bad and good choices, it's about looking at the structural challenges one is facing. And then what you describe is, I think, eminently correct, and of course been described for quite a few years now by analysts like Yanmei and others, of course. But China has built a state-directed industrial machine of a scale that the world probably hasn't seen before, which is combining all these tools, right? Subsidized finance and protected home markets and state procurement and technology absorption and local content logic and strategic standard setting, and of course also export controls directed at Europe's economy. So the deeper issue here isn't only that China is producing a lot, it is that China has now, across a number of sectors, accumulated structural or strategic industrial leverage in batteries and critical minerals and clean tech and advanced manufacturing. All these issues we know. And what we are about to face is the consequences. And that's the consequences many have dubbed the China Shock 2.0. And I think what we're looking at now is indeed massive. European assessments are identifying between 400 and 800 harmonized standard customs categories that are exposed to Chinese overcapacity pressures. So this is not one sector, this is systemic, and this can have devastating consequences on Europe's industry, on its economy, but also ultimately on one's position in the world, on one's political and strategic autonomy. So this is the situation what is facing. And if you look at China's last 5-year plan, it's not only confirms the direction, it's doubling down on self-reliance in these critical sectors, AI, semicon, aerospace, quantum, clean technologies, and so on and so forth. And self-reliance may sound defensive, but in practice, this is very much and increasingly so a displacement strategy, which also means that all our foreign suppliers, all our exporters to China are looking to be replaced. So I think we've been living too long in this sort of belief in this old bargain that we can sell Airbuses and cars and machinery and luxury goods, and China would sell their part, very often lower value goods, and both sides would gain. That world is over. It is about weaponization. It is about what this means for industrial survival and ultimately for economic security and security. So this is not only about the trade balance, it is what we should call a macro imbalances shock to the whole economic system, where China is becoming the world's systemic industrial surplus power. Just very simply, something sinister at work. I would put it differently. They are pursuing a coherent strategy of supremacy, and we need to open our eyes and react to that now.
So just how big a challenge is this to the European economy and more widely to our European way of life? Surely we must accept and we must have anticipated that we couldn't go on indefinitely with a situation we had, say, 20 years ago, where we sold the Chinese Airbus planes and luxury cars and the Chinese sold us bras and T-shirts. Isn't it just part of a reordering of the world in which Europe has to get used to the fact that we can no longer count on cheap Russian energy, American security protection, and an infinite Chinese market?
Well, you're right. Again, of course, we must accept that the world has changed. But I don't think that is the same as accepting industrial decline and accepting economic insecurity and accepting that big power like China, which has the intent and the capacity to use these dependencies, will do so against us. So this is what one must measure up against. Yes, we have lost 3 comfortable assumptions at once: cheap Russian energy, predictable American protection, and an infinitely expanding Chinese market. So that is a brutal adjustment in our mind. But what we must understand is that we are no longer just competing with Chinese firms. We are competing by firms backed by the full power of the state, and that is something else. So we're facing this existential situation. Of course, industrial ecosystems in Europe will not disappear overnight. They will erode slowly. Skills go, suppliers go, investors dry up, innovation migrates elsewhere. But one day, capacities will be gone. And that is what many describe as a boiling frog scenario. And by the time these losses are visible politically, then we have a big difficulty. And that's the challenge to Europe's way of life you're talking about, Europe's social model, welfare states, but also ultimately our capacity to deliver on the green transition within our sort of autonomous decision-making, but also our defense capacity, which all require industrial and technological base. So this is about strategic autonomy. It's not about a nostalgia for the old world. It is whether Europe can adapt to this new brutal world without becoming a playing field for China or being a playing field for the US or for both.
So what do you advocate that Europe needs to do to prevent being steamrolled by China's mighty industrial export wave? Aren't the measures that you favor precisely the ones that Europe finds unacceptable when the United States uses them against us or indeed against China? Do Europeans really have the stomach for such an economic fight?
That's also an excellent question, Paul. And you mentioned President Macron speaking about a European-style Section 301 last week. And that is also one of the things we proposed in our paper with Varg. And of course, so many people have similar ideas. There are others who've written about this. Not everybody has all the ideas. But I think the key issue here is that Europe, in a sense, needs to move from openness to a capacity of deterrence. And that doesn't mean abandoning openness. It means ending unconditional openness and having a capacity to react and to negotiate with these other powers, and here in question, China. And it's interesting because, what was it, 6 months ago, the Commission was to put forward an economic security doctrine. And in reality, it never did so. It puts forward a policy document, a communication on economic security in the end, but it wasn't a doctrine. And I think what the doctrine one could argue for here is sort of a doctrine of reactive assertiveness. And that's interesting because this notion of reactive assertiveness is actually something some of the scholars who've been following China very closely, some 10, 15 years ago, started noting that that's the way one could actually describe what China was doing vis-a-vis other partners that they felt threatened or pressured by. So I think, in a sense, this is a way we can learn from China. Europe should not seek confrontation in any way, but we must be capable of defining red lines, preparing responses in advance, and also then act when coercion or systemic distortions crosses those lines. And that was what we weren't capable of doing when it came to Trump's Liberation Day tariffs, when it came to the knock-on effects, if you want, on export controls on critical minerals, what we weren't capable of doing in the cases of the Xperia crisis, and that we sort of somehow timidly managed to do in the context of the Greenland crisis. So this is about, getting Europeans, the EU member states to develop a capacity to act together, to be reactively assertive. And I think just to finish on that, I think there are different layers to this. One is, of course, having the capacity of using existing tools faster and harder, from import surveillance, safeguards, anti-subsidies, foreign subsidies regulations, anti-coercion instrument. But I think also we must realize that this toolkit is too fragmented and too slow. So product by product trade defense is not enough when what you're facing is systemic overcapacity. And that is where this idea of a European Section 301 matters. And the point here, Paul, is not to copy Trumpian unilateralism and opportunism and unpredictability. The point is to give Europe credibility and predictability in being able to move faster than the standard legal procedures. So the critical aspect of Section 301 in the US, and what would I think is critical in Europe for credibility, is either you function on some form of automatic triggers, or you have what you would call some form of political determination of systemic unfairness or coercion to trigger action. And that's the credibility you need. Others must believe that Europe can restrict access to its market if these practices continue. So these are not quite the same tools that we criticize the US about. I think we would remain more proportional, rules conscious, and also in a sense defensive, reactive assertiveness in purpose. But the uncomfortable truth is that a purely sort of legalistic Europe cannot survive in the world where others are using interdependence coercively. And then, the final question here is, do Europeans have stomach for this? And you mentioned sort of the French versus the others. And I think not yet, but I think we need to understand the choice. There is a price, certainly, of acting in these terms. We will face retaliation, higher cost frictions. You have Chinese that are going around Europe telling, don't you dare moving in this direction, that convene the whole European press corps to their embassy and say, look, we can stay friends, or life will get very tough for you. So clearly, we must face the world of escalation with China. But I think we must also be conscious that there's a price to pay of not acting, which is what we described: industrial decline, dependence, loss of autonomy.
Well, thanks. You're really arguing that Europe needs another big bazooka alongside the bazooka that it hasn't yet used on trade with the United States. Yanmei, let me turn to you. It's seen from Beijing. What are the reasons for China's export surge to Europe? Is it a deliberate act of policy aimed at making China the world's dominant industrial power, or rather a reaction to setbacks in the domestic Chinese economy and to US protectionism? How does it look from China's side?
I think the answer sounds like a little bit banal. It's a combination of all of those, right? So the China wants techno-industrial upgrade and perhaps global dominance. That's deliberate. Right? So it has been stated pretty explicitly throughout the years in, a series of Chinese policy document. I think the one that has kind of shocked the world was the Made in China 2025, when China mapped out a whole suite of industries and mapped out detailed market shares it wanted domestic companies to obtain both domestically and internationally. And that, after China mapped out the industries, it did not leave much room for other countries' industries to grow. So China's most recent 5-year plan, the 15th 5-year plan, again mapped out a all-spectrum techno-industrial dominance. So this includes upgrading legacy industries. So these are the steel, aluminum, cement, plastic, etc. Expanding emerging industry. So these are the clean energy industries, the batteries, the solar panels, the electric vehicles, and also forward deploy future industries, including biomanufacturing, fusion energy, AI, advanced machinery, right? So it doesn't, again, and when China, the state, has a goal of cultivating this technology, it throws the whole plethora of state tools to cultivate and expand these industries and aid them to grab market shares both domestically and internationally. Right? So, and then as a result of that, it's not the intention. It often does create overcapacity, because governments, central governments and local governments, do not know when to stop to give subsidies to expand the capacity. And the banking sector, which is mostly state-owned, does not stop when there's overcapacity. So companies, we're seeing, like the EV industry, in the solar panel industries, companies keep losing money because they're fighting with each other on price wars, but they can still count on getting bank loans, getting local government subsidies to keep expanding their capacity. And as a result, they're driven ferociously to export to other markets, particularly the European market. And the third element you mentioned is the United States. So because the US is closing its market to the US, now Europe remains the only single market that has a large and also relatively wealthy consumer base, right? Also has clean energy transition goals, which is the most prized market for Chinese products, where Chinese companies can presumably command a premium to offset the loss they have domestically due to price wars.
Yeah. Well, how would you expect China to react if the EU were to move to adopt a European equivalent of Section 301 of the US Trade Act, as Georg was advocating? How likely is it that President Xi Jinping would enter negotiations and accept voluntary export restraints, currency revaluation, or reduced subsidies in some sort of grand bargain with the EU?
I think retaliation is much more likely than negotiated settlement. Right? So I think that was kind of the track record. And the track record is that China is pretty skillful at identifying the weakness in EU member states. Right? So for Spain, pork is the underbelly, pun intended. And for Germany, of course, is the car industry. And for France, perhaps France as Italy is the luxury products, right? So China is very good at identifying these weak points and poke them and threaten to raise tariffs on these products, and then undermine the European unity, because individual members' paying threshold is lower than arguably the EU collectively. And also, now China also has the trump card of the rare earth. I think a lot of European companies are deathly afraid of China using this trump card, which can cause them to sudden production shutdown. And they have been, I know, particularly German industries have been lobbying very hard, German politicians, not to rock the boat in terms of relationship with China because they're afraid of being targeted. They're afraid of the pain. And hence, so far, we have seen that Germany oftentimes is pretty silent on this kind of trade dispute with China, and oftentimes also goes against Brussels when Brussels wants to bring a more muscular method in this, trade confrontation with China.
So China's fairly confident that it can divide and rule, divide and conquer.
I think that, and also based on the past records, let's be frank, what Georg was referring to as this narrow legalistic approach has not been effective, right? Let's take the most recent example of the EV tariffs. Brussels was able to hold the line. Germany's attempt to divide Brussels, divide the EU was not effective. Most EU members stood behind Brussels, and Brussels raised tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. But then Chinese currency against the euro quickly depreciated by 10 to 15%, one, which offset most of the tariffs. And two, Chinese companies were very quick pivoting to hybrid cars rather than pure battery cars. So the latter was subject to tariffs and hybrid are not. So as a result, we're seeing that hybrid export to the EU has climbed up a wall. At the same time, export of pure battery vehicles to the EU also recovered. Right? So I think for now, based on history, China can have confidence that one, either the divide and conquer playbook can work, or two, that this EU's kind of very deliberate, narrow, legalistic approach would not be effective enough.
Well, obviously, China's a fairly authoritarian state, which has moved gradually from one-party rule increasingly towards one-man rule. Do you detect any awareness, any dawning in Beijing that China may be overplaying its industrial hand and inviting retaliation, first from America and now from Europe, that may damage the Chinese dream that Xi Jinping has promised everyone?
I think it's perhaps the effect is a combination of increased confidence, paradoxically, as well as increased feeling of defensiveness. The confidence is that I think I have been hearing and reading for quite a few years that trade defense measures against China have been multiplying, rising across the globe. But if we look at the macro numbers, it's not effective, right? So China's export keep reaching new records, and EU and Southeast Asia and UK imports of Chinese goods keep fresh new records. So I think again, a lot of these trade defenses are pretty narrow, pretty timid, and end of the day not very effective. And also, I think created the sense of China is under siege. So that makes Xi Jinping wants to double down on this techno-industrial upgrade and techno-industrial dominance playbook.
Yeah, and there's nobody there who has the authority or indeed dares say, Mr. President, maybe we're overdoing it.
Yeah, and I think also we have to understand that oftentimes we can try to mirror image, right? So I think the West tend to think that China wants the same thing as Western countries, which means, sustainable, economically sustainable investment, profitable companies, comparative advantage, companies compete with each other, states stay out of the way. So at least Xi Jinping's China has fundamentally different set of goals. The goal is national greatness. It's not comparative advantage.
Well, the final question to both of you in a couple of sentences. How do you expect this to end? And do you think that perhaps more Chinese investment into Europe could become an acceptable alternative to economic warfare? Or would the Europeans just see it as, in the words of Clausewitz, economic warfare by other means? Yanmei, let me start with you.
We probably could see a few years of EU sort of incrementally try to raise the trade barriers and drive more Chinese FDI into Europe in the attempt to capture more value added and perhaps technology transfer to Europe, right? So I want to say with that, Europe can perhaps look at history a little bit more and also look back in time and look broader geographically. Back in time, what I meant was, kind of study China's case of China tried to use this method of tech transfer, joint ventures with its own car companies in order to try to produce its own globally successful car brand. That actually did not succeed, right? So all the joint ventures in the internal combustion engine cars did not produce a single successful Chinese global brand in that sector. Instead, it was the batteries and EVs, which had no joint venture or no forced transfer from foreign companies that made a globally competitive industry. And so I think you should study the pros and cons and failures and success of those, the different set of playbooks. And the second, I want to say broaden geographically, because there have been countries who have been applying this method of raising trade barriers in order to compel Chinese EV companies to localize production. Thailand is one of them. But then the result is the Chinese companies bring their overcapacity and price wars into Thailand. So we've been seeing since the beginning of this year, Chinese EV companies have been slashing prices by 20, 30, 35% in Thailand. And the result has been kind of decimating the car industry in Thailand. So I think you should also kind of study what has worked, what has not worked in those incidences before making the final call.
Georg, how about you? Same question. How do you expect this to end? And is Chinese investment in Europe preferable to Chinese exports, or are they both equally menacing?
I think Yanmei made an excellent answer to that and sort of warning about Chinese investment and thinking too optimistically about it. Of course, there's a lot of talk now about quality FDI as that being a solution and setting rules and so on and so forth. But I think there's a trap in there too, where it's very likely that, when Chinese car companies now are buying up factory production capacity in Europe, or even brands that have sort of stopped being used, as in the case in Spain, that ultimately a lot of the value added will be and will remain in China, and it's sort of going to hollow out the car industry from the inside, from the EU. So, of course, I think we'll go quite far down that road, but I think it's far from sort of the magic solution here. And in terms of sort of how this will end, well, I think what Yanmei's, the points she's making are absolutely correct and super important. Of course, this will not end with clean bargains or in any form of return to old-style globalization. There's no need sort of reset where we go back to previous area. The world is gone. Yanmei spoke about history and sort of I reread recently this book, a long book by Dean Acheson, Present at the Creation. It's just incredible how it starts talking about, one needs to recreate order out of disorder, and the story about creating a world out of chaos and what emerged was a system built around openness with American security guarantees and the idea that economics and geopolitics could increasingly be separated. And that separation, I think it has collapsed. The Biden administration spoke about the small yard, high fence. No, I think we are going to talk about automotive, where you have security measures that are being taken on key industrial economic sectors. It's a completely different world. So I think what we are really in now is a moment of armed interdependence. Others have written about weaponized interdependence. It sort of echoes Robinson's old warning about beggar my neighbor dynamics, which feels now remarkably contemporary. And the real question there for Europe is, are we sort of entering this era strategically or passively? And I think sort of sticking then, and those will be my last words, with Yanmei's sort of return to history, I think we need to re-understand sort of what deterrence is about. We read sort of the Thomas Schelling's, the Cold War strategies and deterrence theories that spoke about deterrence, which is fundamentally about shaping expectations. And that is Europe's main issue now. It's not a lack of market size or industrial capacity, but it is that neither Beijing nor Washington fully believes Europe is prepared to bear the costs to defend its interests. And that is, I think, why this debate ultimately goes beyond trade policy and into the topics you've just described. This is about political psychology and credibility also. I think European still has agency. We have these markets. We do have some technological choke points. China is more fragile than many assume. So the outcome is not predetermined. But what is critical for Europe is something that always is psychologically very difficult for Europe. That is to be united, and be united now remaining open, but united also in being capable of deterrence and absorbing pain.
So ultimately, it's about whether the European Union can develop a collective spine. Well, That's all we have time for this week, but you can find more on the Brussels Economic Security Forum and read the review on our website, www.epc.eu. The Language of Power will be back in 2 weeks' time with more on EU-China relations, asking what European and Chinese think tankers talk about when they get together behind closed doors in a program sponsored by the European Commission. Until then, I'll say thanks to my colleague Simona Lusuardi for helping organize and record this podcast, and thanks to you for listening in.